everybody. Welcome to Rebel Fantasy Football. I'm your host, Jacob Stecky. I hope you guys are doing well. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. It helps the channel out a lot. And yeah, let's get into it. I hope you guys had a good week 6 of the NFL season and of fantasy football. Hope you guys have a positive record. I know for me, I have one league where I feel pretty good, but then another league where I don't feel as good. So hopefully today's episode can help you guys feel a little bit better about your teams, help you get ready for week 7. Crazy that we're already a big chunk into the NFL season already. So this is where it starts getting interesting because we're going to have more injuries and a lot more question marks, especially with bye weeks. So make sure you're up to date. I'm going to be going over the latest news right now to try to help you guys be the most up to date you can be so that you can be playing the right guys for your team. So injury news. Big injury news from this last week of week 6. Marquise Brown, he suffered an ankle injury. And this was kind of a weird situation because he was seen wearing a walking boot right after the game. And so obviously if you see a guy with a walking boot, you're going to kind of assume the worst and assume that he's probably going to be out for a long time. But Marquise said himself that the initial x-rays came back negative, which is a good thing. And they were waiting to hear more information on Monday. He said this like right after the game on Sunday, and then Monday he said they would have to wait to know more. So everyone's like, okay, he's gonna miss time, but he may not miss the whole season. And then there was like rumors that came out yesterday morning about, oh, it's probably a potential season ending injury. And then the Cardinals traded for Robbie Anderson, and so everyone's like, oh, he's out for the whole season. And then they came out saying that, oh, he's probably going to miss 6 weeks. He has a chance to come back. So it was kind of a weird roller coaster of misinformation, and probably people have no idea what they're talking about, and they just like to assume things. So rule number 1, don't assume things like that. But hey, it's okay. So interesting situation. He is definitely going to miss time. I wouldn't be surprised if this 6 weeks turn into longer, especially because they have a bye week kind of around that 6 weeks. So he may miss 7 or 8, or if his recovery doesn't go quite as planned, he may miss the rest of the season. But he's going to miss at least a big chunk of time, which is a bummer because he was playing lights out. He was playing really well for fantasy purposes. And so you're gonna miss having him on your team. But yeah, it definitely sounds like he's gonna miss significant time. Another injury, J.K. Dobbins, his knee kind of tied up during the game, so he just came back, recovered from a knee injury, and now it's kind of already bothering him, which is a big bummer. And so we're not fully sure if he's gonna miss time yet. I would probably guess that they might hold him out for week 7, but they haven't said anything yet. Randall Cobb suffered an ankle injury. I believe it was a high ankle sprain, so he's definitely going to miss some time. We're not sure how long, but I believe he's going to be missing the next game. Justin Fields, so a couple quarterback injuries. Justin Fields injured his non-throwing shoulder in that Thursday night game. Sounds like he's questionable for week 7, but sounds like he still has a good chance to play. We're not fully sure yet what the severity of the injury is yet. Kenny Pickett suffered a concussion, which is a bummer because he was playing pretty well starting that game. And he's most likely going to miss week 7 just because the concussion protocol is kind of strict right now, as you guys know. And so it's generally taking guys a little over a week to clear the protocol, even if they don't have symptoms. So he's probably going to miss week 7. Carson Wentz, this was a bummer. He fractured his finger in week 6's Thursday night game. And this, I believe for him, this was another one that was kind of going back and forth. They were throwing out 6 weeks. They were throwing out 8 weeks. But I believe the latest is that the recovery time he's looking at is 4 weeks. So the team's not sure if they're going to put him on IR yet. But he's most likely going to miss at least 4 weeks. So if you picked him up off the waiver wires, and if he was the main guy you were playing at quarterback, you're gonna have to find someone else for 4 weeks. But you'll probably be able to play him again. A couple injuries in news prior to week 6. So guys that were ruled out before the game started: James Conner and Darrell Williams. These guys were ruled out for the Cardinals. This one's iffy because they play Thursday night, Cardinals versus the Saints. And so it's kind of unknown if they're going to play. It sounds like they won't. Darrell Williams at least sounds like he's not going to play for Thursday night. James Conner is still questionable. But all signs are kind of leading to it being the Eno game again for Thursday night. So if you have Eno, you may want to fire him up again. Dalton Schultz, he was ruled out with a knee injury. His knee's kind of bothering him still, which is a bummer because we were hoping that he was able to recover from that. Dak Prescott was ruled out before. Sounds like he has a really good chance to play for week 7. So that's good news. So if you have Dak Prescott, or maybe you were streaming Carson Wentz while Dak Prescott was out, that's pretty good timing for you. But you will most likely be able to play him for week 7. A bunch of Lions players that were ruled out in week 5 and they were able to rest during the bye: DeAndre Swift, DJ Chark, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams. So a lot of injuries here. We're kind of waiting to know if all of them are going to be able to come back after the bye. I believe that DJ Chark and Amon-Ra St. Brown should be good. DeAndre Swift, he was dealing with an ankle and shoulder injury, and so his injuries, I think, were a little more severe than the other guys. They also are very careful with him because of his injury history, and so they were trying to play it safe by holding him out a couple games before the bye. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they hold him out like another game, but they haven't said anything yet. So I think all these guys have a really good chance to play. Obviously, they're coming off a bye week, so they should be able to play. Jameson Williams, we're still kind of waiting to hear if they're going to indicate that he is returning from IR or not. I think he probably has a good chance of coming back in the next couple of weeks. I don't know if it's confirmed or for sure that he'll play for week 7, but I think they'll probably start slowly easing him back. Darren Waller for the Raiders, he had a hamstring injury. He had a bye week as well last week, so we're hoping that he'll be able to come back for week 7 after resting from the bye. I think my problem with this, though, is that we've seen a lot of hamstring injuries this season, and they pretty severe. Like, they hold guys out several weeks. And so I'm a little questionable for him. My feeling is that he may miss week 7, but they haven't said anything official yet, so don't fully take my word for it. But if you have Darren Waller on your team, I would try to find another option just in case. It doesn't hurt to pick up a guy off the waiver wire and just have him ready to go. And if you drafted Darren Waller, you probably already do because you know that his injury history. But I would just have a guy ready to go. Keenan Allen, another hamstring injury. He's been out so long, which is a big bummer. Sounds like they keep saying this, like, oh, he's eyeing this week for return, and then that week comes and then he doesn't play. But it sounds like he's pretty close to playing. He should play for week 7. That's what they keep saying. But honestly, at this point, they could just keep this going. But stay a little bit hopeful that he'll be able to play for week 7. Tua, dealing with that concussion. As you guys know, we've talked about it. Sounds like the plan is for him to start week 7, which is awesome. Chris Olave, he was in the concussion protocol. Sounds like he is pretty much close to clearing it. He's pretty much done with it. So he should be good for Thursday night. His fellow teammates, though, Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry, sounds like they're going to miss the game, which is a bummer because they've been out a long time and they kind of need Michael Thomas. But sounds like Olave is going to play, which is good news because they're going to need someone to throw to and for Thursday night against the Cardinals for the Saints. And then in regards to Jameis Winston for the Saints, I think we're still waiting to hear if he's playing for Thursday night. I think we're not fully sure yet. I think he has a good shot, but I don't think they've ruled him out quite yet. A couple non-injury related news that you guys probably have already heard about. Cam Akers, we've talked about him a lot, and I'm kind of tired of talking about him because it's just a roller coaster of emotions, but he was ruled out coming into week 6 for an undisclosed reason, and then rumors came out slowly after game started that it sounds like he's played his last snaps with the Rams. Sounds like there's backstage drama between him and Sean McVay, probably some other head coaches or other coaches of the Rams, and we don't fully know the reason. My guess, I think everyone's guess right now, is playing time. I mean, he wasn't played week 1, and obviously that's going to bother a player. But I think for the Rams argument, sounds like he doesn't practice hard, and that they don't feel like he's ready to start. And so there's this weird like tension between him and the Rams. And I think because of that, tensions probably got heated and it probably got to a high, and now the Rams are trying to trade him. So it escalated pretty quickly. Sounds like the Rams are holding him out until they can trade him. At least they started doing that for week 6. They didn't play him at all, that he was inactive. And then rumors came out that the Rams were actively trying to trade him. So what does this mean for fantasy? If you have the bench space, I would keep him on your bench. I'm curious to know where he goes if he does get traded. If you're in a pinch and you have a 5-man bench and you have bye weeks and you need someone to play and you have to drop him, then that's fine. Because it's a bummer. Like you probably won't be able to play him for a while. Even if he does get traded, like we don't know what that timeshare is going to be. He could get traded to a team where it's just going to be another split again, and then at that point he could just be the same production that he's been doing for the Rams. So it's up to you guys on that one. I would try to keep him if you can. I'm really curious to know where he goes. If he does go to a team that is injury ridden and they really need a running back, I think he could be effective there, but kind of a weird situation, and we're going to kind of have to wait to know more. Robbie Anderson, we talked about it. He got traded to the Cardinals from the Panthers. I think this is a big news, and we'll talk about it in the waiver wires, but if Marquise Brown injury does last a long time, more than 6 weeks, I mean, even 6 weeks, I think he's a guy that you could pick up and possibly play, because if anything were to happen to D-Hop or Rondale Moore, then Robbie Anderson is probably going to be Kyler's main guy. So kind of big news happened yesterday. Definitely interesting how it played out. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure you guys were aware. All right, let's get into waiver wires. As you guys know, all these waiver wire targets I go over are generally all under 50% rostered. So depending on your platform, they may be a little bit higher, they may be a little bit lower, but all of these guys I try to target are generally under 50% owned. And so running back waiver wire targets, it's a little iffy. There's not a ton of guys that I feel comfortable with you guys spending a lot of FAAB on. But the main guy I think you guys should go for is Kenyan Drake on the Ravens. He went off on Sunday. He had 10 carries, 119 yards, and 1 touchdown. And J.K. Dobbins, obviously with his knee, it kind of held him out. And so Kenyan Drake was the guy that took over. Gus Edwards, Justice Hill were inactive. And so they had Kenyan Drake and Mike Davis to take over. Well, they had Kenyan Drake and Mike Davis behind J.K. Dobbins. So when J.K. Dobbins started suffering that knee tightness, Kenyan Drake and Mike Davis were the guys. And so they needed someone to step up, and Kenyan Drake did. We've seen him do this before. I think he's a very capable running back. I think he's pretty underrated. He just goes to teams where it's a timeshare. So you don't feel comfortable drafting him or spending a lot of FAAB on him because you're nervous about that timeshare, which I totally understand. Last year on the Raiders, he was with Josh Jacobs, and he had some good games. He was a good pass catcher for them. But you don't feel 100% confident in starting him because of that timeshare. And I think it's the same thing in this situation. I think he's still worth picking up, but you're picking him up knowing that the Ravens love to use running backs. They love to cycle them through. And there's a lot of running backs that are still potentially coming back. You have Gus Edwards supposed to come back soon. You have Justice Hill supposed to come back soon. I think Kenyan Drake is a better running back than those guys personally. And so it goes to show if the Ravens are going to realize that and be like, oh yeah, Kenyan Drake, you're going to be the guy until JK comes back. And I think because of that possibility, it's good to pick him up. In regards to how much FAAB you should spend on him, I think it depends on on your running back situation if you are hurting at running back and if you need a guy with potential. I'd be willing to spend. I'd probably be willing to spend 40% of my FAAB on him at most. I think if you're really hurting at running back and you need a guy that has potential, I think 40% would probably be a pretty good chunk. But also, in regards to gauging how much FAAB you should spend, make sure you look at your league, look at the other managers and see how much they've already spent. I know a strategy that I like to utilize is I look at the guy who is probably going to go for that player, and I look at his needs. I see, okay, yeah, he's probably going to want Kenyan Drake because he has nobody at running back, and he probably wants to try to find someone off the waiver wire. And then I see how much FAAB he has left, and if you have more FAAB than him, it doesn't hurt to like at least bid one more FAAB than what that owner has. And I know that's kind of, some people may think that's a dirty move, but hey, it's a good way to secure the player that you want against the managers who are also wanting that player. So I think Kenyan Drake is the main guy that should be picked up this week. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. He had a really good week 6, and I think if J.K. Dobbins continues to have knee problems, and if he's held out for several weeks, and if Gus Edwards and Justice Hill are still struggling with their injuries, they're going to play Kenyan Drake over Mike Davis for sure. And so it's just, the question is, how long are you going to be able to play Kenyan Drake is the problem. And so you're picking him up and spending FAAB on him, knowing that he may not be a week-to-week guy for a ton of time. It may be a pretty short stint. But I think he's still worth the flyer and worth the pickup to see how long that actually lasts. Because if it lasts a lot longer than we think, that could be really good for your team. Second waiver wire pickup for running backs is Latavius Murray. This was an interesting situation going to the game last night, Broncos versus the Chargers. Melvin Gordon was supposed to start. Everyone expected him to get the chunk of the carries, and he only had 3. Latavius Murray out carried and out snapped him by a lot. Now Latavius Murray didn't really do a whole lot with those carries. He had 15 carries for 66 yards. So a lot of carries for not a ton of yards. But I think he's worth the pickup. I wouldn't spend as much FAAB on him as I would Kenyan Drake. I would probably spend 15%, 20% Latavius Murray. Maybe less depending on what other guys are available in your waiver wire. But I think he's worth a pickup. I think if they're going to continue giving him the ball, especially with Russell Wilson's injuries, sounds like Russell suffered a hamstring injury last night. So if Russell continues to be hurt, they're going to run the ball more. And I think it's going to be kind of like the Ravens, where they're just going to, they don't care who it is, they're just going to play him. I think Latavius is a capable running back. I don't think he's amazing, but I think he's capable, and I think he's trustworthy, which is why teams like to play him. And so, yeah, I would pick him up. I think it'd be an interesting player, at least to have on your team. Next couple weeks, they play the Jets and the Jaguars. And so, depending on how the situation shapes up, he could be a guy that you have to play because of a bye week. And so I would take a look at him. If you're really hurting at running back, I would pick him up. A couple of handcuffs, guys, that I'm not telling you to spend a ton of FAAB on, because right now, if you were to pick them up and play them, they're not going to get a whole lot for your team. But they could in the future if the main running backs on that team gets hurt. So one of the guys is Malcolm Brown in the Rams. Now that Cam Akers is kind of officially in the doghouse forever, Darrell Henderson is that main guy again for the Rams. And so the backup for him is essentially Malcolm Brown. I don't think Malcolm Brown is amazing, but if something were to happen to Henderson, I think they're going to lean on Malcolm Brown, and I think he would be capable enough to at least be like an RB3. So if you have the bench space, if your league is really deep, and if you have Darrell Henderson, you're worried about his injury history, I think Malcolm Brown could be worth a pickup. You probably could just get him after waivers process. So you probably don't even have to spend FAAB on him. Or if you want to do like a $0 or $1 FAAB request, that's totally fine too. But he could be a good handcuff for you. Sony Michel for the Chargers could be another good handcuff. They still give him work even when Austin Eckler is in the game. But I think he definitely would be more than capable. If Austin Eckler were to get hurt, I think Sony Michel would do just fine. He had 8 carries last night, and he had 3 targets for 3 receptions. So for PPR, he got 7 points, which obviously isn't amazing. You're not going to want to play him, but he could be a good handcuff just to make sure that if you are an Eckler owner, if anything were to happen to Eckler, that you would have the backup for that team so that you don't have to lose that running back spot. Or if you're just another guy and you're struggling at running back and you're trying to figure out, okay, who would that next handcuff be? Who would that next Kenyan Drake be? These are 2 of the guys that you can pick up right now so that if anything were to happen, you don't have to worry about waiver wire requests or spending FAAB. You would already have them. So that's the reason why I go over those handcuff options, because I think it's good to know who are possibly some of the future waiver wire running back targets if anything were to happen to the main guys. Now, all that to say, those guys can never get hurt and they could be in that same handcuff position for the rest of the season. So just keep it in mind. I think they're good guys to keep an eye on at least. All right, wide receiver waiver wire targets. First guy we talked about, Robbie Anderson. I think he should be number 1 waiver wire target this week. I think he's a capable wide receiver. I don't love him specifically. A lot of people like him better than myself. But I do think he's a capable wide receiver. And I think with the situation in which he's going to on the Cardinals, I think he could do well. He's going to a team where their leading wide receiver is now out at least 6 weeks. Now, their true main wide receiver is coming back this week, DeAndre Hopkins. But then after DeAndre Hopkins, you have Rondale Moore and AJ Green. I think Rondale Moore will still be that number 2, like he was behind Marquise Brown when D-Hop was suspended, as we've seen the first 6 weeks of the season. But I think Robbie Anderson will be that number 3 guy. They don't really show a ton of trust in AJ Green. I think he can help you out in a pinch, but he's not going to be that trustworthy number 3rd wide receiver. And I think Robbie Anderson can be that guy. And with the injury history of this team, if anything were to happen to D-Hop or Rondale Moore, and they've struggled with their injuries, if anything were to happen, he would be the number 1 or number 2 target option for this team under Kyler Murray. Like, that's something that for fantasy you want to be attached to. And so I think he would be a really good waiver wire pickup. If you're really hurting at wide receiver, or if you just need that upside, I'd probably be willing to spend 40 to 50%. I think he has a really good opportunity ahead of him. You're picking him up knowing that it's probably going to take a couple weeks for him to get his feet under him and get acclimated to a new team. So if you really need to play him this week, you probably won't be able to, just because they play Thursday night and they've said it themselves that he's going to be playing under a limited package. So keep that in mind if you really need him for this week. But I think he's a guy you should look for that has a lot of potential for the rest of the season. Another guy is Wan'Dale Robinson on the Giants. I think he's another guy that has a lot of potential for the rest of the season. He's a rookie that the Giants really like, and he's been dealing with a knee injury. So this was like his first game back since that injury. He started week 1, he got hurt, and then he's missed the last 4 games. And so just coming back, they're kind of easing him into it. He didn't play. He only played like 23% of the snaps, but he had 4 targets, 3 receptions for 37 yards and a touchdown. And so that's pretty good. He got 12 fantasy points. I think he's a guy that, especially with that team's injury history for their wide receivers, I think Daniel Jones is going to really lean into him. And I think he has a lot of potential for the rest of the season. They also have like really good matchups coming up too. They're playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, Seattle Seahawks, Houston Texans, and Detroit Lions. And so you got a lot of juicy matchups in there that even if you don't trust Daniel Jones as quarterback, which I don't trust him, you still need someone to throw to. And I think Wan'Dale Robinson can be that guy for him, especially considering that they have a lot of injuries with Kadarius Toney, Sterling Shepard. Like, a lot of their wide receivers get hurt. And so if Wan'Dale's healthy and if they're able to get him fully healthy, I think he can be a really good option. Probably a similar situation to Robbie Anderson, where you may not feel great about starting him right away, but I think he has a lot of potential for the rest of the season. I probably would spend 30%, 25% to 30% of FAAB on him if you're really needing a wide receiver, but I think he could be a good option. Another wide receiver is Tyquan Thornton on the Patriots. This guy had a really good game on Sunday. He had 5 targets, 4 receptions, 37 yards, and a touchdown in the air. And then he also had a touchdown on the ground too. So he had 2 touchdowns. He had 21 points, which is awesome. You're not gonna fully trust his workload because the fact that he got a rushing touchdown and then he got a receiving touchdown, but he only had 37 yards. Obviously, he's gonna need a touchdown to be fully relevant for fantasy, but I think he's a good boomer bust guy. I mean, we saw coming into the draft his ability coming out of Baylor. Like, he is a really explosive and athletic player, and I think if the Patriots can use that to their advantage, I think he could be a good guy for fantasy. He's not going to be the most volume heavy type of guy that you generally want for full PPR, but he definitely can be a good high potential boom player that if you really need a guy to play during a bye week and you want a guy with a high ceiling, I think he would be your guy. You can probably get him for cheap. I don't think a guy's gonna spend a ton of FAAB on him. I would probably spend 15% on my FAAB, 15 to 20%. I think he has potential, but you're picking him up knowing that, especially with how the Patriots use their wide receivers, you don't know if it's going to be him, Devonta Parker, Nelson Aguilar. Like, you just don't fully know who's going to get the majority of the looks. So you're picking him up knowing that there are a lot of unknowns, and that he's not going to be the most consistent wide receiver that you can pick up. But I think he's an interesting look and an interesting flyer for sure. A couple other quick mentions. Paris Campbell had a really good game for the Colts. And Devonta Parker had a solid game for the Patriots. These are 2 guys where I think they're good players. I think they're very inconsistent from week to week. So I think they're worth a look for you guys, but I can't necessarily say, hey, you should go pick them up, because they had really good week 6s, but then they could get you 2 points for week 7. But I would go for this first 3: Robbie Anderson, Wan'Dale Robinson, Tyquan Thornton. And then if you guys are really struggling, I would look for Paris Campbell, Devonta Parker personally. But if you like Paris Campbell or Devonta Parker more than those other guys, then feel free to go for them. But those are guys that had good week 6s, and it's going to be interesting to see how their future is going to pan out. Specifically with Paris Campbell, he did really well because Matt Ryan threw the ball over 50 times on week 6. Part of that was because their running backs were hurt. And so when the running backs come back, I don't think Matt Ryan's going to throw it that much. At least not that much. He still throws a lot though, which is why I don't trust Paris Campbell to continue to get all of that volume. Mainly because they had to do it for week 6, but once Jonathan Taylor comes back, I don't think Paris Campbell would be as explosive as he was for week 6. I guess let's say that. A couple honorable mentions, guys that are rostered in over 50% of leagues, but just over 50%. And so they may be available in your league. So I think you should check out these guys first. If they somehow are available in your leagues, I would pick these guys up over any of the guys I just mentioned. But the first guy is Rondale Moore. If Rondale Moore is available in your league, I would pick him up because he's going to be the number 2 wide receiver option on the Cardinals. Some people may think that Robbie Anderson might be the number 2 option. So we're going to kind of have to wait to see. But I would be surprised if Robbie Anderson were to take over Rondale's spot, just because Rondale has been operating as the number 2 wide receiver under Marquise Brown. And even last year, Rondale was playing really well. And they were definitely excited to elevate Rondale Moore's volume. And now with him being healthy from injury, I think they're going to give him more looks. And so if he's available in your leagues, I would pick him up. I think he could be a good flex option. Chase Claypool, he had a really big game on Sunday. He's very inconsistent week to week. they have a lot of passing options on that team, so it's hard to fully trust him every week. But he had a really big game, and so if he's available in your league, I would pick him up. And if you're struggling with wide receiver for the bye weeks, I think he's worth a play. He's another guy that has a high ceiling, but he kind of has a low floor, so he may not get you a ton of points every week, but he may have one week where he goes off like he did last week. So I would take a look at him, see if he's available in your leagues. Alec Pierce, he had a really good game for the Colts. If he's available in your leagues, I would pick him up right away. I think he's going to be a good flex option for the rest of the year. And he's owned in a little over 50% of leagues. So he may be available in your league. I would definitely take a look and see if he is, because if you need a wide receiver, I think he would be a good play, as well as these other two guys as well. I think either of these three guys would be a good flex option for you. All right, tight end waiver wire targets. First one is Robert Tonyan on the Packers. If you guys are struggling with tight end, Robert Tonyan had a really good game on Sunday. I believe he had over 10 targets, which is a lot for a tight end. And so if Aaron Rodgers is starting to trust Tonyan more, then that's a guy you're going to want on your team. Even if he doesn't get a ton of yards, and even if he doesn't get like a ton of touchdowns, the fact that he had over 10 targets is great for full PPR, especially for a tight end. So I would pick him up first. I think he's going to be a good streaming option. And if you have a bye week to your tight end, or if you're just streaming tight end from week to week, I mean, why not go for Robert Tonyan? Like, what do you have to lose at that point? Hunter Henry, he's another guy where he has a high ceiling, but it's kind of dangerous playing him week to week, especially the fact that he shares time with another tight end, Jonnu Smith. But I think the reason why I'm positive on Hunter Henry is because this last week he showed that he can still produce with Jonnu Smith playing. Jonnu played that game, and Hunter Henry still had a touchdown, and he still was a big target for even the third string quarterback for the Patriots, Bailey Zapp. He was a guy that was looking for Hunter Henry early and often. And I think when Mac Jones comes back, I think the same will happen. I think they'll look for Hunter Henry more. We saw last year that Hunter Henry can produce in fantasy. He had a lot of touchdowns last year, and we haven't fully seen that yet. But if he can continue the touchdown train going, I think he's going to be a really good streamer and a really good tight end play. And if you're struggling at tight end, and most people are struggling, if you don't have Kelsey or Andrews, you're probably struggling at tight end. So I think Hunter Henry is worth the flyer. I think he's worth the pickup, and possibly the play, depending on the week. Third tight end to mention is Mike Gesicki. The reason why I don't have him higher in this list is because he's so volatile. He had a huge game. He had 2 touchdowns. I believe he had over 20 points. And I think he's a more than capable player. I think he is a good player. But I think he's in an opportunity and in a situation where it's hard to trust him. He hasn't been playing with Tua the last couple of weeks. And when he did play with Tua often didn't look his way. And so when Tua comes back, which he's supposed to come back this week for week 7, I have a hard time trusting Gesicki. I think he has a high ceiling. Obviously, we saw in week 6, he went off for over 20 points. And that's a guy that I don't mind having on my team, but I have a hard time playing him. So if you have the bench space and if you want to see what happens with him, I wouldn't mind picking him up, putting him on my bench, and seeing if he continues to do well. I just think he's so inconsistent that I have a hard time playing him and trusting him. I think that Robert Tonyan and Hunter Henry are more consistent and will be more consistent than Mike Gesicki. Now, if Gesicki proves me wrong, that's a guy you're going to want for sure. He's on a high-powered offense with a good quarterback and a quarterback that likes to throw a lot. So, yeah, use that to make your decision. If you feel like, man, I think this guy could be more consistent this year, then pick him up. Pick him up and see what he does. I just don't trust him as much as the other 2 guys, which is why I have him at number 3 in my list. Honorable mention, he's still under 50% rostered, but I have him as the 4th guy on this list, is Daniel Bellinger on the Giants. He's a guy that Daniel Jones is starting to look to and throw to, mainly because they have a lot of injuries in their passing game or in their receiving game. And so I think Daniel Bellinger could be a good stream depending on the week. He had a good game. He had 15 fantasy points. And so if you're struggling at tight end and all of these first three guys that I mentioned are taken, look for Daniel Bellinger. You can probably get him for really cheap. You probably don't have to spend much FAAB on him at all. You can probably pick him up after waivers process. So I would take a look for Daniel Bellinger. I think he could be a good option. Quarterback waiver wire targets, which I actually feel like there's quite a few. There's quite a few quarterbacks that played really well this last week that are probably not rostered. The first guy being Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan had a game. He had over 50 attempts, and I believe he had 30 fantasy points. I'm gonna fact check that real quick. He had 58 attempts, 42 completions, 389 yards for 36 fantasy points. He had 3 touchdowns and no interceptions. So he had a monster game, and which probably no one expected. This is what's so funny about fantasy, and the reason why I can do my best to try to predict things and encourage you guys to make certain moves. But at the end of the day, sometimes things just happen and you can't predict it. I think you can probably look at Matt Ryan and say, okay, I could see him having an okay game. But the week before, he had 6 points. Like the week before, he struggled against the Broncos. And then against the Jaguars, he had a top 5 fantasy football finish by a quarterback. So it's hard to predict things in fantasy, which is why when we're talking about waiver wire targets, I think there are guys that you can pick up based off their performance during that previous week. So we're looking at Matt Ryan and we're saying, hey, he had a really good performance for week 6. He had 36 points. I think he could be worth picking up for the future. Now we could pick him up this week, and then the next week for week 7, he could get 6 points again. And so it's fully hard to predict. It's hard to know what's a trend and what's just smoke. And so I think for Matt Ryan, I think it's not completely smoke. I think he'll continue to do well. I don't think he'll throw as much as he did. Like I just talked about, I don't think he'll throw 58 times again just because Jonathan Taylor is coming back. But if we look at the season, he averages like 37, 40 attempts. So he throws a lot anyways, which I think could be good. If he continues creating a rapport with Alec Pierce and Michael Pittman and Paris Campbell, I think that's going to be really good for him. Next couple of weeks, he's playing Tennessee, Washington, New England, Las Vegas. So not terrible matchups. I think he could be worth a stream. I know for me, I'm a Kirk Cousins owner, and so Kirk has a bye this next week. And so Matt Ryan's going to be a guy that I'm looking at. Now, I don't love him against Tennessee, and if Jonathan Taylor does come back, makes me a little iffy as to his ceiling. But Matt Ryan, I think, is still a very capable, solid quarterback. And so he would be the first guy I'm looking for on the waiver wire if you are struggling at quarterback. It kind of is up to you how much FAAB you do want to spend on him. Because I think for mostly in your league, like the other managers probably have their quarterbacks locked up. So you probably don't have a ton of guys going for a quarterback right now, which is why I can't encourage you to spend a lot of FAAB. But if you want to put in 10, 15% just to secure him, then I think go for it. Another quarterback to talk about is Marcus Mariota. He had a great game. And he had a really surprising game. The Falcons played really well against the 49ers, and they were able to take them down. Marcus Mariota had 28 fantasy points, mainly because of his rushing ability. Now, he had 14 attempts, 13 completions for 129 yards and 2 touchdowns, but he had 6 carries for 50 yards and 1 touchdown. So his rushing ability is great. He still shows that even at age 28, he's still a very capable rusher. And I think that's a guy that you do want for fantasy. He worries me similar to Matt Ryan because of his inconsistencies. 2 weeks ago, he got 3 points. So if you pick him up this week and you're like, oh yeah, he can get me 28 points, and then next week he gets you 3 points, you're going to be pretty disappointed. I think he's still worth picking up, and I think he's worth the stream. Next week they play the Cincinnati Bengals, and so I don't mind playing him against the Bengals. I don't think he's going to get 28 points again, mainly because I don't. Yeah, like he had a really good game against the Niners. He had 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. But the Niners are one of the best defenses. So if he can do that against the Niners, I think the assumption is that he can do that against anybody, but I'm just not sure. I don't feel as confident with him as I do other guys. Like even Matt Ryan, I feel better about Matt Ryan than I do about Marcus Mariota, which is why I have Mariota at 2. But I think Mariota does have a high ceiling with his rushing ability. And if you play in 4-point passing, like if you don't play in 6-point passing like I do, then you probably want to prioritize Marcus Mariota because of that rushing ability. But if you play in 6-point passing touchdowns like I do and like how I rank my stats, then I would do Matt Ryan first and Marcus Mariota second. But Mariota, he could be a good pickup. Next couple of games after the Bengals, they play the Panthers, the Chargers, the Panthers again, the Bears, the Commanders, the Steelers. So his matchups are pretty nice, I will say. I see a lot of potential there. There's not a team on that list where I'm like, ooh, I'm scared about. I'm probably the most scared about the Bengals, to be honest. But the Bengals defense hasn't been shut out. So there could be a lot of possibility and potential there. And it's just kind of up to you guys if you want to play him or not. A third guy to mention is Jimmy G, 49ers. Even though the 49ers lost to the Falcons and they didn't look amazing, Jimmy still didn't do bad. Jimmy had 20 points. He had 41 attempts, passing attempts, 29 completions for 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. He had 296 passing yards. So not an amazing game, but he's been solid. The last 3 weeks, he had 20 points, 22 points, and 20 points for fantasy purposes. Now, just like I said, all of these stats that I'm reading are in the 6-point passing touchdown stats. So if you guys are playing with 4-point, he's going to obviously have a lot less points than that. But for 6-point passing touchdowns, I think he's a very capable quarterback. He doesn't have as high a ceiling as Matt Ryan or Marcus Mariota, which is why I have him at 3, but he's consistent. They're playing the Kansas City Chiefs for week 7 at home in San Francisco. And so it's going to be an interesting game. I wouldn't be opposed to playing him. If you have no other option, and if you want to go for Jimmy's consistency, even against the Chiefs, I would be willing to do it. I'm not going to feel great about it. I'm going to feel a little iffy. But I'd be willing to do it. So, yeah, Jimmy's the third guy on my list for quarterbacks. I think a couple guys that may be rostered over 50%, but like I mentioned before, I would take a look and see if Jared Goff, Geno Smith, Trevor Lawrence, see if those guys are available. Because often, if you're playing in a 12-team league, there are a lot of teams in your league probably aren't rostering 2 quarterbacks. So if they're not, there's probably a lot of guys on the waiver wire. And so I would look to those other guys first to see if they're available, because I probably would play them over these 3 guys I just mentioned. But any of those guys, 6 guys I mentioned, I think could be capable fill-ins for you this week if you're like me and you need a quarterback. So take a look on your wire and see who's available. All right, let's talk about trade targets real quick. A couple of guys to mention, and just for you guys to keep in mind and maybe see if the manager in your league is willing to talk about trading them, or maybe you have them and you're like, man, I don't know what to do with this player. Should I keep him? Should I trade him? What should I do? So a couple of guys to mention. One, buy low option, which I think is an interesting idea, is to buy low on Najee Harris. Now, Najee Harris, I think it's probably safe to say that he's been the biggest bust so far this season. one of the biggest bust. He was a guy who was drafted in the first round by pretty much everybody in their leagues, and he has not performed to that expectation. Well below. Now, I think part of that is because of his injury. He did suffer a foot injury during training camp, and so he came into the season trying to fully recover from that foot injury. I can't blame everything on that foot injury because I think part of it is his performance, and I think part of it is the team. But last week he was able to take out the steel plate from his foot, and so he's starting to feel better. I think he said this last Sunday was the best he's felt, and he didn't do terrible for fantasy. His opportunities weren't amazing, and so that's why I'm a little iffy on him. But if you look at how he performed this last week, he had 14 attempts, rushing attempts for 42 yards, 3 targets for 2 receptions, and 1 touchdown. So he finished with 12 points because of the touchdown, obviously. So not terrible. You just don't feel great about it because last season he was a guy that was getting like 30 rushing attempts a game, which was nuts. And so I think he could be a buy low candidate just because of his upside. Even if he doesn't get as many carries as he did last year, he's still a very good player. I was going to say capable. I've said capable a lot this episode. He's more than capable. He's a great player, obviously. And so he has elite upside. And the fact that his value right now is probably the lowest it's ever been. And so if you're really struggling at running back, and if you're feeling like, man, I just need to take a shot on somebody, I would look to Najee Harris, see what the manager wants for him. Maybe the manager is really struggling. I know the Najee Harris manager in my league is 1-5. And so he's definitely willing to trade Najee because he's like, man, I just need to do something. Like, if he holds a Najee and he continues to not do well, then he's just going to continue to lose games, and that's going to be frustrating for him. But if you're trading for Najee, you need to understand that you're taking on a lot of risk. As you guys know, you'd be trading for Najee knowing that, okay, he has a lot of upside, but he could continue to not do very well. If he didn't have that touchdown last week, he would have got 7 points. Actually, he would have got 6 points. So keep that in mind. If he doesn't get his touchdowns, if he doesn't get the volume that he does, and if he doesn't execute with that, then he's not going to perform as well as he did last year, as we've seen this season. But I think he has a lot of upside, and I'd be willing to take a risk on him. I would first ask that manager, see what he wants. But if you guys have like a solid flex wide receiver, or maybe 2, I would maybe leverage those guys for Najee. Or maybe if you have like a lesser running back, like maybe you have a Tony Pollard and you want to throw on Rondell Moore for Najee, that's pretty cheap to me. Now, you're understanding that Najee, his value is very low, and the owner of Najee should understand that as well. But I think that he could be a guy that's worth it, because if you trade for him and say he does okay the next couple of weeks, but then say he does super well, say he goes off, his value is just going to go right back up to where it was when the season started. As soon as he has that big game, his value is going to be way back up, because everyone's going to be like, oh, he's back. Maybe he's back. And so I think this is the time to get him when people don't think he's back, and when he's kind of slowly easing back into it. But I think he can do it. I don't think he's broken. I think he still has a chance to finish the season strong. Obviously, you're taking on that risk, so you got to figure out if you want to shoot your shot. For me personally, I'm willing to do it, but I also understand that I'd be doing something that has a chance to fail. So think about that for yourself. Come to your own conclusion. Maybe you're like, man, it's not worth it. But it also depends on who you're trading. It all depends on who you're trading. So see what you're able to offer. But if you have guys that you're like, man, I don't really care about these guys, like even if they do well, I think Najee would be worth it. I'd say go for it. All right, another guy to talk about, a guy that I think if you can, you should buy high on is Breece Hall. Now it's going to be hard to buy high on him. I don't want you to spend your whole team on him. But if you're somehow able to buy high on him, maybe the manager doesn't love him somehow. They probably do. I would try to buy high on Breece Hall. I think he's really good. I think he's a really good player. And I think he's just going to continue to do well. He's a guy that, for full PPR fantasy purposes, he's amazing because he gets a lot of targets and a lot of receptions. Now, he hasn't in the last couple of weeks, which is good to know. This last week, he had 2 targets for 2 receptions for only 5 yards. So you're thinking, oh, he probably didn't have a good game. Well, he did really good on the ground. 20 rushing attempts for 116 yards and 1 touchdown. He had 22 fantasy points. The week before that is when he had 2 targets, 2 receptions for 100 yards. So 2 receptions for 50 yards each, which is nuts. He's a guy that has a super high ceiling and he has a really solid floor. He hasn't gotten worse than 10 points this season. Now, it's going to be hard to trade for him. But I don't think it hurts to just inquire about him from the manager. Maybe message that manager and say, hey, who would you want for Breece Hall? Maybe they're really struggling at wide receiver, and maybe that's where you're really strong at. So leverage your strengths to help your weaknesses. If you're struggling at running back and you're like, I have a lot of wide receivers I can spend, try to spend them for a guy like Breece Hall. Now, if they're asking for way too much, figure out where that line is for you and then stick to that line. Make that boundary and make sure you don't cross that boundary, because if they ask for a lot and you end up being like, oh man, I really want Breece Hall, I'm going to trade a lot for him. Just make sure you don't spend something ridiculous to where it's going to hurt you in the long run, no matter if Breece Hall does well or not. Because if the Breece Hall manager is trying to take advantage of you, you need to be careful, because I know what it feels like being like, oh, I really want this player, and then just being willing to spend anything for him, because that often can really hurt you. A guy that I think you should sell high on is Juju Smith-Schuster. I think right now you can sell him pretty high. I think there will be people that are a little iffy on him, but he had the biggest game of his season so far. He had 27 fantasy points, 5 targets, 5 receptions for 113 yards and 1 touchdown. Now, I really like Juju. I think he's a good player, but the reason being why I think you should sell high on him is because of his inconsistencies with the Chiefs. And that doesn't really speak to him. That just speaks to how the Chiefs offense runs. Right before the season started, Patrick Mahomes even said it. He said, hey, we're not going to be throwing to one guy all the time. We're going to be mixing it up. We're going to be spreading it around. We don't have Tyreek Hill anymore. We have good wide receivers, but I'm not going to be throwing to the same guy every time unless your name is Travis Kelce. And so Juju Smith-Schuster has seen that. He's seen a good amount of targets. 4 weeks out of the 6 weeks of the season so far, he's seen 8 targets, which is great. But he generally only gets 5 receptions out of those 8 targets, and he generally finishes with about 70 yards. And so this is the first time that he's scored so far, and I think you can find a manager that is really high on Juju to be like, oh, he's going to start scoring a bunch. And if you find a manager that really believes in Juju, I think you can swap him and trade him for someone more consistent and someone who their team leans on them more. Now, I don't think you should trade Juju for scraps. I think you should try to get value from him. But he's a guy that if you have him on your team, he had a really big week, and I would be willing to trade him and try to see if you can get value from him. Now, like I just said, don't trade him for nothing, but I think he could be worth trading away to get value. A couple shoot your shot options, guys that are really high caliber, big name guys, but they're kind of inconsistent sometimes, and the managers may not trust them. But a couple of those guys, Deebo Samuel, he's going to be hard to get, but it doesn't hurt to ask. He often will have games that are like 10-point games, but then he'll have a couple games where we'll have 20, 30-point games. But he doesn't go off every week. And so if you have a manager of Deebo that's like, man, I expected him to do what he did last year, well, maybe ask him, hey, who would you want? I think he could still be worth retrieving. I think he's definitely going to be a good player the rest of the season. He's not going to get as many points as he did last year, but I think he could be a good guy to trade for. AJ Brown, he's another guy that has really good weeks, but he doesn't always have the most consistent weeks from week to week. But I think he could be a good guy to try to shoot your shot for. And then Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle, I think I would love to own one of those guys on the Dolphins if you're able to. But those guys are going to be pretty expensive. But it doesn't hurt to ask and say, hey, who'd you want for one of these top guys? Often the managers, if the managers of those guys are struggling, if their team is 1-5 or 0-6 or 2-4, then offer them their weaknesses and try to make their team better, to try to make your team better. So if they have one of these top guys and they're really struggling at running back and you're like, hey, here's a couple running backs and here's a solid flex wide receiver, then maybe they'll go for it. But it's really hard to know. It's kind of just based off everyone's preferences. But I don't think it hurts to ask for them. So that's the episode. I hope this was helpful to you guys. If you did enjoy the episode, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. I would greatly appreciate it. It helps me out a lot. If you have any questions, if you have any start-sit questions, let me know down in the comments, and I'd love to communicate with you guys. Follow me on Instagram, RebelFFPod. I post my weekly player rankings. So I'll try to help you guys with start-sit questions on who I would play over other guys. I'll post those on Thursday. Feel free to interact with me in the comments as well. I've had a pretty cool interactions last couple of weeks about start-sit questions and trade questions. So I love it when you guys ask me those so I can interact with you and tell you my opinions and my thoughts on those. Obviously, they're all my opinions. So what you guys choose to do with them is up to you. But I would love to at least try to offer my advice and try to help you the best I can. So hope you guys are having a great day, and we will see you next time.